Hello, thanks for joining us in this channel. My name is Sunny and I'm going to be your DevOps tutor. And today we're going to be doing Kubernetes with EKS, and EKS is a managed Kubernetes platform graciously managed by Amazon Web Services. And if this is your first time joining our channel, please click the subscribe button and watch out for more videos. And you can make a request for any video you want us to walk you through. So we are going to be taking you today with Amazon EKS. So the first thing we do is we go to our console, so our AWS management console. Then you sign into your console. I'm signing in as the root user. The first thing you want to do is come to the right of your screen where you have your username, and you click on the drop down and you go to security credentials. In security credentials, you realize that you must have one credential as the root user, which is your access key and secret access key. And just in case you lost access to that key, then what you want to do is to create new access keys. Okay, but if you have your access keys and secret access key, you can skip this phase. But if you're doing it for the first time, after signing in, you will have this access key. But just in case you no longer have access to these keys, you can go ahead to create another pair of keys for root access. So I generate the key. I have my access key and my secret access key. I'll simply download these keys as the root keys. So I save them to my downloads. Okay. Now this is done. I go to my Kubernetes service. The next step you want to take is to go to the Amazon Elastic Kubernetes service, and there you want to add a cluster. Okay, you select your region. Which region do you want to add your cluster in? I could go for, let's choose US West 2, for example. So I want to create a Kubernetes cluster in US West 2. Okay, so I go to create cluster, and the cluster I want to create a Hilltop EKS. Okay, so I'm creating the Hilltop EKS cluster, and the version, you can select, this is the latest version by default. These are minor versions, so I'll go with the latest. And you need a cluster role. Select an iron role to allow the Kubernetes control plane to manage AWS services on your behalf. So you have several of these roles. You can pick any of the roles, but if you don't have the role, then you can click on this button, create a role for Amazon EKS. So it takes you to this console, and you're creating for an AWS service EKS cluster. Next. So it gives you this Amazon EKS cluster policy. Next, and the name of the role. You want to call this role, let's give it a name so that we can easily remember. Hilltop EKS role, like this. Everything is okay, and I create role. The role is created. You can see Hilltop EKS role. So I come back to my page where I'm creating the EKS cluster, and I click the refresh button. I should find that role here. So I simply select on the role, and access to the Kubernetes API, we leave this as default. We can access as an IAM user or using the config map. So we leave this as default, and we go to the next page. Do you want encryption? You can add tags if you want. And the VPC, so you see by default, it selects the default VPC in this region. So we go with the default VPC, and it selects all the 4 subnets in this region. Do you want a security group? You can choose to add a security group or not. Everything still works fine. We're using IPv4 address, not IPv6. And cluster endpoint access, configure access to your Kubernetes API and server endpoint. So we leave this as both public and private. You can always change these settings later. And I go to next. Do you want to configure observability for your cluster? This, it's optional. You can choose, but I don't want. So I go to next. Now it asks for add-ons, core DNS service, kubeproxy, VPC CNI, and also the EKS port agent identity. So we leave these default settings and we select. And now for the add-ons we have selected, you see we have the versions of the add-ons. We can leave the default versions as selected and we go to next. So it gives you an overview of your EKS configuration and then you create cluster. So this normally takes about 8 to 10 minutes thereabout. It's in creating state. And now we have just created a Kubernetes cluster and we do not have data nodes or compute node, like you call it worker nodes. We don't have them yet. So if you go to compute, it says cluster not found. Why? Because our cluster is still in creation state. So when we are done creating this cluster, we are going to come back and add the worker nodes. So while that is going on, we are going to pause the recording. And when the cluster is up, we are going to continue with our recording. Hello, welcome back. You can see our EKS cluster is active and you can see some metadata about the cluster, the role and everything. But what you don't see is we don't have any nodes that are part of this cluster. All we have is the control plane, which has been created and is the managed one. And that's why it is EKS and it's managed. And now there are two types of node groups we can create. We can create the Fargate type. We can create the manage node group type. So we haven't had any node yet. So we go to add node group. And the name of our node group, we can call it same name, Hilltop node group, like this. And we need an IAM role. And this IAM role is the role that allows the nodes or the EC2 instances that we are creating to join the control plane. So we have a populated node group here, but if you're wondering how I got this IAM role for the nodes, you can go to the IAM console again from here. And they ask you what services do you want, AWS services, and for EC2 instances, because we're creating now EC2 instances. If you go to next, you see it auto-selects some 3 or 4 policies from here. So if I go to next, you're going to see it selected these 3: AWS EC2 Container Registry read-only, AWS EKS CNI policy, AWS EKS Worker Node policy. So you give a name to your role and then you create the role. So we are going to use the role we already have, and the name of the role is EKS Node Group role. So let's see if that role exists. We go back to roles here. You see, we have EKS node group role, and we expect that role to have the 3 policies. These are the 3 policies, which is okay. So we select the role back here. We have the role, and we don't want a launch template. We don't want any taints on the node. You can add tags, it's optional. And the type of EC2 instances, like when you create EC2 instances, it follows the same principle. We can go for Amazon Linux too. You could choose any other as you want. What type of EC2 instance do you want, an on-demand or a spot? Now, a typical question in the AWS Solutions Architect is if you're running a workload that is tolerant to maybe unavailability, it can be unavailable, it's fault tolerant and all of that, then you can go for spot instances because it's like an auction instance. Some other person could place a higher bid and then it's withdrawn from you at any moment. But on demand, you're reserving a capacity. So it's reserved for you. And the instance type, I'll recommend T3 medium. If you go with T2 micro, you might have issues deploying ports on the EC2 instances. And then you go to your scaling configuration. What is the desired size? We want 2 EC2 instances running at all points. Minimum size, if there is an upgrade or something, how many should we have at a time? So you can go to 1. And the maximum capacity, if scaling is taking place, it can scale right up to 3. And you can go with the configuration if you want it to scale based on number or on percentage. So if you put 1 maximum unavailable should be 1, it means when scaling is taking place, you scale 1 at a time. You go to next, and the subnet, it auto selects the subnet of your default VPC. You go to next, and it gives you an overview of your configuration, and you go to create nodes. So now it might also take a couple of minutes for us to have these nodes coming up. So you're going to see the nodes are going to come up here. This is a node group, and we still have the nodes. The nodes are going to come up here. If you go to our EC2 console, if you go to the EC2 console, we expect to see 2 nodes which are coming up. So they are not yet, but in a moment, we expect to see 2 EC2 instances in the launch phase. So we are going to give a couple of minutes for those nodes to come up, and meanwhile, we take a little break. Welcome right back. It took about 3 minutes for our EC2 instances to come up, treated medium. You see all health checks are passed. And if you go back to the EKS console, you realize that we have 2 EC2 instances of size instance type 3.3 medium running, and they are all in ready state. So the next thing to do is to connect to our EC2 instances or to our Kubernetes cluster. And to connect to the Kubernetes cluster, all you want to do is to open up your terminal, and the requirements. The first thing is you need to have the AWS CLI configured. You also need to install your kubectl utility. Those are the prerequisites to be able to connect to your EC2 instance. Now, the first thing we need to do is to authenticate to our Kubernetes cluster. Now, to authenticate to AWS, remember we created some access keys. So we're going to use those access keys to connect. And don't worry about seeing my access keys, because I'm going to delete those access keys once we are done connecting to it. So the first thing, you run AWS configure. And for access key, we use this. And for the secret access key, we use this for our secret access key. For region, I have to go back and verify what region we used. So our region here is US West 2. So for region, US West 2. And we leave it in JSON format. So we're authenticated to our Kubernetes cluster, and we can begin to run workload in the cluster now. And now, to be able to run workload in the cluster, it's a simple command, kubectl. You must make sure your kubectl utility is installed, okay? So I have my kubectl utility installed. So I can run kubectl get nodes. Voila, we have our 2 EC2 instances, which are part of our worker nodes, and they are ready. And we can also run kubectl get nodes, and we specify a namespace in the kube system namespace. So we get kubectl get ports in the kube system namespace. So these are the ports running in the kube system namespace. So this was it, very short video, how to create an EKS cluster and authenticate to your Amazon EKS cluster. So If you want to know how to deploy workload, deploy a pod, deploy an application into your EKS cluster, please follow for the next video how to deploy a pod or how to deploy an application and access that application on your browser from the EKS cluster we have deployed. So thank you. And if this is your first time joining our channel, please do follow, do like, do subscribe, comment. You can make a request and I'll be right on to do the next video for you. So thank you very much for this session.